Italian poetry also fed the genius of Edmund Spenser (1552 99). While a student at Pembroke Hall, Cambridge, he had translated some of the Visions of Petrarch and the Visions of Bellet, a French poet, but it was only in 1579 that the publication of his Shepherd's Calendar announced the coming of a great original poet, the first since Chaucer. The Shepherd's Calendar was a pastoral in 12 eclogues, one for each month of the year. There had been a great revival of pastoral poetry in Italy and France, but with one or two insignificant exceptions, Spenser's were the first bucolics in English. Two of his eclogues were paraphrases from Clement Marot, a French Protestant poet, whose psalms were greatly in fashion at the court of Francis I. The pastoral machinery had been used by Virgil and by his modern imitators, not merely to portray the loves of Strephon and Chloe, or the idyllic charms of rustic life, but also as a vehicle of compliment, elegy, satire, and personal allusion of many kinds. Spenser, accordingly, alluded to his friends, Sidney and Harvey, as the shepherds, Astrophel and Hobbinol, paid court to Queen Elizabeth as Cynthia, and introduced in the form of anagrams names of the High Church Bishop of London, Aylmer, and the Low Church Archbishop, Grindal. The conventional pastoral is a somewhat delicate exotic in English poetry, and represents a very unreal Arcadia. Before the end of the 17th century the squeak of the oaten pipe had become a burden, and the only piece of the kind which it is easy to read without some impatience is Milton's wonderful Lycidas. The Shepherd's Calendar, however, though it belonged to an artificial order of literature, had the unmistakable stamp of genius in its style. There was a broad, easy mastery of the resources of language, a grace, fluency, and music which were new to English poetry. It was written while Spenser was in service with the Earl of Leicester, and enjoying the friendship of his nephew, the all accomplished Sidney, and was perhaps composed at the latter's country seat of Penshurst. In the following year Spenser went to Ireland as private secretary to Arthur Lord Grey of Wilton, who had just been appointed Lord Deputy of that kingdom. After filling several clerkships in the Irish government, Spenser received a grant of the castle and estate of Kilcolman, a part of the forfeited lands of the rebel Earl of Desmond. Here, among landscapes richly wooded like the scenery of his own fairyland, under the cooly shades of the green alders by the Mulla's shore, Sir Walter Raleigh found him in 1589, busy upon his Faery Queen. In his poem Colin Clout's Come Home Again, Spenser tells, in pastoral language, how the Shepherd of the Ocean persuaded him to go to London, where he presented him to the Queen, under whose patronage the first 3 books of his great poem were printed in 1590. A volume of minor poems, entitled Complaints, followed in 1591, and the 3 remaining books of the Faery Queen in 1596. In 1595 96 he published also his Daphnaida, Prothalmion, and the 4 hymns on Love and Beauty, and on Heavenly Love and Heavenly Beauty. In 1598, in Tyrone's rebellion, Kilcolman Castle was sacked and burned, and Spenser with his family fled to London, where he died in January, 1599. The Faery Queen reflects, perhaps more fully than any other English work, the many-sided literary influences of the Renaissance. It was the blossom of a richly composite culture. Its immediate models were Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, the first 40 cantos of which were published in 1515, and Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata, printed in 1581. Both of these were, in subject, romances of chivalry, the first based upon the old Charlemagne epos, Orlando being identical with the hero of the French Chanson de Roland, the second upon the history of the First Crusade and the recovery of the Holy City from the Saracen. But in both of them there was a splendor of diction and a wealth of coloring quite unknown to the rude medieval romances. Ariosto and Tasso wrote with the great epics of Homer and Virgil constantly in mind, and all about them was the brilliant light of Italian art in its early freshness and power. The Faery Queen, too, was a tale of knight-errantry. Its hero was King Arthur, and its pages swarm with the familiar adventures and figures of Gothic romance, distressed ladies and their champions, combats with dragons and giants, enchanted castles, magic rings, charmed wells, forest hermitages, etc. But side by side with these appear the fictions of Greek mythology and the personified abstractions of fashionable allegory. Knights, squires, wizards, hamadryads, satyrs, and river gods, idleness, gluttony, and superstition jostle each other in Spenser's fairyland. Descents to the infernal shades, in the manner of Homer and Virgil, alternate with descriptions of the palace of pride in the manner of the Romaunt of the Rose. But Spenser's imagination was a powerful spirit, and held all these diverse elements in solution. He removed them to an ideal sphere, apart from place, withholding time, where they seem all alike equally real, the dateless conceptions of the poet's dream. The poem was to have been a continued allegory or dark conceit in 12 books, the hero of each book representing one of the 12 moral virtues. Only 6 books and the fragment of a 7th were written. By way of complimenting his patrons, and securing contemporary interest, Spenser undertook to make his allegory a double one, personal and historical, as well as moral or abstract. Thus Gloriana, the Queen of Faery, stands not only for glory, but for Elizabeth, to whom the poem was dedicated. Prince Arthur is Leicester, as well as magnificence. Duessa is falsehood, but also Mary, Queen of Scots. Grantorto is Philip II. Of Spain. Sir Artegal is justice, but likewise he is Sir Arthur Grey de Wilton. Other characters shadow forth Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Philip Sidney, Henry IV. Of France, etc., and such public events as the revolt of the Spanish Netherlands, the Irish rebellion, the execution of Mary Stuart, and the rising of the northern Catholic houses against Elizabeth are told in parable. In this way the poem reflects the spiritual struggle of the time, the warfare of young England against Popery and Spain. The allegory is not always easy to follow. It is kept up most carefully in the first 2 books, but it sat rather lightly on Spenser's conscience, and is not of the essence of the poem. It is an ornament put on from the outside, and detachable at pleasure. The Spenserian stanza in which the Faery Queen was written was adapted from the ottava rima of Ariosto. Spenser changed somewhat the order of the rhymes in the first 8 lines, and added a 9th line of 12 syllables, thus affording more space to the copious luxuriance of his style and the long-drawn sweetness of his verse. It was his instinct to dilate and elaborate every image to the utmost, and his similes especially, each of which usually fills a whole stanza, have the pictorial amplitude of Homer's. Spenser was, in fact, a great painter. His poetry is almost purely sensuous. The personages in the Faery Queen are not characters, but richly colored figures, moving to the accompaniment of delicious music, in an atmosphere of serene remoteness from the earth. Charles Lamb said that he was the poet's poet, that is, he appealed wholly to the artistic sense and to the love of beauty. Not until Keats did another English poet appear so filled with the passion for all outward shape of beauty, so exquisitely alive to all impressions of the senses. Spenser was, in some respects, more an Italian than an English poet. It is said that the Venetian gondoliers still sing the stanzas of Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata. It is not easy to imagine the Thames bargees chanting passages from the Faery Queen. Those English poets who have taken strongest hold upon their public have done so by their profound interpretation of our common life. But Spenser escaped altogether from reality into a region of pure imagination. His aerial creations resemble the blossoms of the epiphytic orchids, which have no root in the soil, but draw their nourishment from the moisture of the air. Their birth was of the womb of morning dew, and their conception of the glorious prime. Among the minor poems of Spenser, the most delightful were his Prothalamion and Epithalamion. The first was a spousal verse, made for the double wedding of the ladies Catherine and Elizabeth Somerset, whom the poet figures as 2 white swans that come swimming down the Thames, whose surface the nymphs strew with lilies, till it appears like a bride's chamber floor. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song, is the burden of each stanza. The Epithalamion was Spenser's own marriage song, written to crown his series of amoretti, or love sonnets, and is the most splendid hymn of triumphant love in the language. Hardly less beautiful than these was Muiopotmos, or the Fate of the Butterfly, an addition to the classical myth of Arachne the spider. The 4 hymns in praise of love and beauty, heavenly love and heavenly beauty, are also stately and noble poems, but by reason of their abstractness and the Platonic mysticism which they express, are less generally pleasing than the others mentioned. Allegory and mysticism had no natural affiliation with Spenser's genius. He was a seer of visions, of images full, brilliant, and distinct, and not like Bunyan, Dante, or Hawthorne, a projector into bodily shapes of ideas, typical and emblematic, the shadows which haunt the conscience and the mind.